The effect of interest on intrinsic motivation. Interest can be described as a psychological state that involves focused attention, increased cognitive functioning, persistence, and emotional involvement. A person's interest in a topic can come from personal and/or situational sources. Personal interest, also referred to as individual or topic interest, is characterized by an intrinsic desire to understand a topic, a desire that persists over time and is based on pre-existing knowledge, personal experience, and emotion. Situational interest is more temporary and is based on context-specific factors such as the unusualness of information or its personal relevance. For example, baseball teams that qualify for or win a league championship or World Series after many years of not doing so, think Chicago Cubs or Boston Red Sox, Cleveland Indians, often spark temporary interest in the players and the games among people who live in those cities. Similarly, people who buy a company's stock often become interested, albeit temporarily, in the company's activities. The degree of personal interest a student brings to a subject or activity has been shown to affect intrinsic motivation for that task. Such students pay greater attention to the task, stay with it for a longer period of time, learn more from it, and enjoy their involvement to a greater degree. It is possible, of course, that situational interest in a topic can grow into a personal interest. Consider, for example, a high school student who knows nothing of how information is stored in and retrieved from memory, but learns about it when she has to read a chapter on memory in her psychology textbook. Fascinated with the description of various forms of encoding and retrieval cues because of her own problems with being able to recall information for tests accurately, she searches for additional books and articles on the topic and even thinks about majoring in psychology in college, and then usually, fortunately, gets over it. Factors that influence personal interest. A long-term interest in a particular subject or activity may be influenced by one or more of the following factors. Ideas and activities that are valued by one's culture or ethnic group. As we discussed in the chapter on cultural diversity, culture is the filter through which groups of people interpret the world and assign values to objects, ideas, and activities. Thus, inner-city male youths are likely to be strongly interested in playing basketball and following the exploits of professional basketball players, whereas a rural Midwestern male of the same age is likely to be interested in fishing and hunting. The emotions that are aroused by the subject or activity. Students who experience extreme math anxiety, for example, are less likely to develop a strong interest in math-related activities than those who experience more positive emotions. The degree of competence one attains in a subject or activity. People typically spend more time pursuing activities that they are good at than activities at which they do not excel. The degree to which a subject or activity is perceived to be relevant to achieving a goal. As noted in the chapter on approaches to instruction, many students fail to perceive such relevance, partly because teachers rarely take the time to explain how a topic or lesson may affect students' lives. Level of prior knowledge. People are often more interested in topics than they already know something about than in topics they know nothing about. A perceived hole in a topic that the person already knows a good deal about. A person who considers himself to be well informed about the music of Mozart would likely be highly interested in reading the score of a newly discovered composition by Mozart. Factors that influence situational interest. Some of the factors that spark a spontaneous and short-term interest in a topic or activity include a state of cognitive conflict or disequilibrium. Teachers can sometimes spark students' interest in a topic by showing or telling them something that is discrepant with the current belief. Consider, for example, a high school class on government. The teacher has a planned lesson on government spending and wants to avoid the usual lack of interest that this topic produces. One tactic would be to ask students if they believe that the money they contribute to Social Security from their part-time jobs or the full-time jobs they will eventually have is placed in an account with their name on it, where it remains until they become eligible for benefits in their mid-60s. Most will probably believe something like that. The teacher could then tell them that the contributions they make today are actually used to pay the benefits of current retirees, and that their Social Security benefits will come from the Social Security taxes levied on a future generation of workers. Well-written reading material. Texts and other written materials that are logically organized and engaging are rated as more interesting by students and produce higher levels of comprehension than more poorly written material. The opportunity to work on a task with others. As we saw earlier in the book, cooperative arrangements are highly motivating and produce high levels of learning. The opportunity to engage in hands-on activities. The opportunity to observe influential models. The teacher's use of novel stimuli. The teacher's use of games and puzzles. These findings have a number of clear instructional implications. Given that some students may develop a strong interest in a topic as a result of a classroom activity or assignment, and that this initial interest may grow into a personal interest and the adoption of mastery goals, a general recommendation is for teachers to do what constructivist learning theory implies: involve students in a variety of subject matters and meaningful activities. If you think about it, the purpose of exposing students to a wide variety of topics during their school years is not simply to provide them with basic knowledge of all those topics, but also to increase the likelihood that students will encounter those topics in situations that engage them, perhaps to the point at which topics grow into personal interests. Many of us have discovered our personal interests, and indeed our careers, as a result of situational interest growing into personal interest. Flow and engagement. The concept of flow has been championed for more than 3 decades by Mr. C. Flow is the mental state of high engagement in an activity. It is characterized by intense concentration, sustained interest, and enjoyment of the activity's challenge. If you have ever been engaged in an activity, in other words, or for example playing a video game or reading a novel, that captured your interest so completely that you lost track of time and had trouble breaking away from the activity, you have experienced something like the state of flow. Factors that influence either personal or situational interest can result in students experiencing flow and developing intrinsic motivation. For example, researchers in China have seen how flow influences engagement in instant messaging behavior and the selection of particular IM products. Research has used the concept of flow as a way of investigating the effects of student engagement in classrooms. Rathund and this other person compared the academic experiences of nearly 300 middle school students, divided into 2 groups: those who were enrolled in a program that took advantage of the factors that influenced both personal and situational interest, called a Montessori middle school program, and students in a traditional middle school program. The students in the 2 groups were matched on a number of demographic factors to help ensure that any differences between the groups were most likely due to the kind of program they attended. The study produced 2 major findings. First, the students in both types of middle school programs reported very similar experiences while engaged in non-academic activities at school. Second, when engaged in academic activities, the Montessori students reported more flow experiences, more energetic engagement in the academic activities, and greater intrinsic motivation than the students in the traditional middle school. Another study by this guy and his colleagues used the concept of flow to examine how high school students spend their time in school and the conditions under which the students felt engaged. They studied a longitudinal sample of more than 500 high school students from across the United States. The high school students reported increased engagement in academic activities when both the challenge of the activity and their own skill were high, when the instruction was perceived as relevant, and when the students felt control over the learning environment. In more concrete terms, the high school students were more engaged in individual and group learning activities, than in listening to lectures, watching videos, or taking exams. The researchers concluded that a sense of flow, for example, or in other words, intense engagement, is more likely when students feel a sense of control over their own learning and when the learning activities challenge students at a level appropriate to their skills. Limitations of cognitive use. Cognitive development. Although cognitive development theory, with its emphasis on people's need for a well-organized conception of the world, can be useful as a means for motivating students, it has a major limitation. It is not always easy or even possible to induce students to experience a cognitive disequilibrium sufficient to stimulate them to seek answers. This is particularly true if an answer can be found only after comparatively dull and unrewarding information and skills are mastered. How many elementary school students, for example, might be expected to experience a self-impelled urge to learn English grammar or acquire skill in mathematics? You are likely to gain some first-hand experience with the difficulty of arousing cognitive disequilibrium the first time you ask students to respond to what you hope will be a provocative question for class discussion. Some students may experience a feeling of intellectual curiosity and be eager to clarify their thinking, but others may stare out the window or surreptitiously do homework for another class. Need for achievement. Perhaps the major problem that teachers have in using Atkinson's theory of need for achievement is the lack of efficient and objective instruments for measuring its strength. Although you could probably draw reasonably accurate conclusions about whether a student has a high or low need for achievement by watching that student's behavior over time and in a variety of situations, you may not be in a position to make extensive observations. And the problem with short-term observations is that a student's achievement orientation may be affected by more or less chance circumstances. Attribution theory and beliefs about ability. The major implication of the idea that faulty attributions are at least partly responsible for sabotaging students' motivation to learn is that students must be taught to make more appropriate attributions. But this is likely to be a substantial undertaking, requiring a concerted, coordinated effort. One part of the problem in working with students who attribute failure to lack of ability is that ability tends to be seen as a stable factor that is relatively impervious to change. The other part of the problem is that the same students often attribute their success to task difficulty and luck, two factors that cannot be predicted or controlled because they are external and random. An additional limitation is that attribution training is not likely to be fully effective with elementary school children. For them, two individuals who learn the same amount of material are equally smart, despite the fact that one person has to work twice as long to achieve that goal. Older children and adolescents, however, have a better grasp of the concept of efficiency. They see ability as something that influences the amount and effectiveness of effort. Now that you are familiar with some of the approaches to motivation, it is time to consider suggestions for teaching that show how these ideas can be converted into classroom practice. Motivating students to learn. Use behavioral techniques to help students exert themselves and work toward remote goals. Techniques you might use for this purpose were described in our discussion of operant conditioning in Chapter 7. They include verbal praise, shaping, modeling, symbolic reinforcers, smiley faces, stars, and the like, and contingency contracting. Give praise as positive reinforcement, but do so effectively. Think about the times when you've been praised for a job well done, particularly when you weren't sure about the quality of your work. In all likelihood, it had a strong, maybe even dramatic effect on your motivation. That being the case, you might think that effective positive reinforcement in the form of verbal praise is a common occurrence in the classroom, but you would be wrong. Observation of classrooms and surveys of students reveal that verbal praise is given infrequently and is often given in ways that limit its effectiveness. Praise and other forms of reinforcement are likely to work best when they are used to strengthen behaviors that students believe they can control, such as reading a book or completing a writing assignment, as opposed to something more general and distant, such as earning a grade of A for an entire semester's worth of work. Jerry Brophy and others who have followed him recommend that teachers use praise in the following ways: as a spontaneous expression of surprise or admiration. Why, Juan, this report is really excellent. As compensation for criticism, or as vindication of a prediction. After your last report, Lily, I said I knew you could do better. Well, you have done better. This is really excellent. As an attempt to impress all members of a class. I like the way Nigan just puts his books away so promptly. As a transitional ritual to verify that an assignment has been completed. Yes, Maya, that's very good. You can work on your project now. As a consolation prize or an encouragement to students who are less capable than others. Well, Josh, you kept at it, and you got it finished. Good for you. In an effort to help teachers administer praise more effectively, Brophy drew up the guidelines for effective praise listed in Table 11.1. Use other forms of positive reinforcement. In addition to verbal praise, you can make use of such other forms of positive reinforcement as modeling, symbolic reinforcers, and contingency contracts. Examples. Arrange for students to observe that classmates who persevere and complete a task receive a reinforcer of some kind. But let this occur more or less naturally. Also, don't permit students who have finished an assignment to engage in attention-getting or obviously enjoyable self-chosen activities. Those who are still working on the assignment may become a bit resentful and therefore less inclined to work on the task at hand. Draw happy faces on primary grade students' papers. Give check marks as students complete assignments. Write personal comments acknowledging good work and assign bonus points. Develop an individual reward menu or contract with each student based on the Premack principle, Grandma's rule, which we discussed earlier in the book. After passing a spelling test at a particular level, for example, each student might be given class time to work on a self-selected project. When making use of such motivational techniques, you might do your best to play down overtones of manipulation and materialism. Point out that rewards are used in almost all forms of endeavor to induce people to work toward a goal. Just because someone does something to earn a reward does not mean that the activity should never be indulged in for intrinsic reasons. For example, athletes often compete to earn the reward of being members of the best team, but they still enjoy the game. Make sure that students know what they are to do, how to proceed, and how to determine when they have achieved goals. Many times students do not exert themselves in the classroom because they say they don't know what they are supposed to do. Occasionally, such a statement is merely an excuse for goofing off, but it may also be a legitimate explanation for lack of effort. Recall that knowing what one is expected to do is important information in the construction of a learning strategy. For reasons illustrated by behavioral theorists' experiments with different reinforcement schedules, students are more likely to work steadily if they are reinforced at frequent intervals. If you set goals that are too demanding or remote, lack of reinforcement during the early stages of a unit may derail students, even if they started out with good intentions. Whenever you ask students to work toward a demanding or remote goal, try to set up a series of short-term goals. Example: one way to structure students' learning efforts is to follow the suggestions offered by Raymond Ludkowski for drawing up a personal contract. He recommends that such a contract should contain 4 elements. A sample contract from Ludkowski is presented here with a description of each element in brackets. Date: within the next 2 weeks, I will learn to multiply correctly single-digit numbers ranging between 5 and 9. For example, what the student will learn. When I feel prepared, I will ask to take a mastery test containing 50 problems from this range of multiplication facts, how the student can demonstrate learning. I will complete this contract when I can finish the mastery test with no more than 3 errors, the degree of proficiency to be demonstrated. My preparation and study will involve choosing work from the workbook activities, number games, and film strip materials, how the student will proceed. Signed. Encourage low-achieving students to attribute success to a combination of ability and effort, and failure to insufficient effort. Should you decide to try to alter the attributions of a student who is having difficulty with one or more subjects, here are 3 suggestions based on an analysis of 20 attribution training studies. Make sure the student has the ability to succeed on a task before telling the student to attribute failure to insufficient effort. Students who try hard but lack the cognitive skills necessary for success are likely to become convinced not only that they lack the ability, but also that they will never become capable of success on that type of task. Tell students that having the ability for a subject is the same as knowing how to formulate and use a learning strategy for that subject. Thus, success is attributable to an appropriate strategy, which is controllable, whereas failure is attributable to insufficient effort at formulating the strategy, also controllable. Combine attribution training with strategy instruction for students who don't understand the relationship between strategy use and success and failure. Encourage students to think of ability as a set of cognitive skills that can be added to and refined, rather than as a fixed entity that is resistant to change, by praising the processes they use to succeed. The work that Carol Dweck has done on students' beliefs about ability clearly shows that those who adopt an entity view are more likely to develop a maladaptive approach to learning than are students who adopt an incremental view. One way to help students develop incremental rather than entity beliefs is to praise them for their effort and use of effective skills rather than for their ability after doing well on a task. Many parents and teachers believe they are strengthening a student's motivation for learning by praising their ability with such comments as, "You did very well on this test," "You certainly are smart," or "You are really good at this." Dweck's research shows that this type of praise encourages to develop entity beliefs that impede their motivation. A better alternative is to offer what Dweck calls process praise. Examples of process praise are, "That's a really high score. You must have worked really hard at these problems. Now that you've mastered this skill, let's go on to something a bit harder that you can learn from. And you did a fine job on this paper because you started early and used the writing skills we practiced in class." Encourage students to adopt appropriate learning goals. As we noted earlier, students may adopt task mastery goals, performance approach goals, or performance avoidance goals. To help students maintain high levels of motivation and achievement, you should establish conditions that encourage the adoption of mastery goals. The problem with performance approach goals is that they suppress intrinsic interest in tasks and encourage students to equate failure with low ability. Performance avoidance goals have many obvious problems, including the reinforcement of low self-efficacy and stunted intellectual growth. Help students develop mastery learning goals. The following suggestions were designed with middle school students in mind, but are just as applicable to both lower and higher grades. Group students by topic, interests, or their own choice rather than by ability. Use a variety of assessment techniques rather than just one, and make the top grade potentially achievable by all students by evaluating performance according to a predetermined set of criteria. Make lessons relevant by emphasizing how the knowledge and skills they are acquiring can be used in their everyday lives outside of school. Provide students with feedback about their progress rather than feedback about how they scored relative to the rest of the class. Recognize students who demonstrate progress rather than focusing just on students who achieved the highest grades. Provide students with opportunities to choose what projects they will do, what electives they will take, and for how long they wish to study a particular subject, rather than having these decisions made exclusively by administrators and teachers. Treat mistakes as a part of learning. Encourage students to take academic risks, and allow students to redo work that does not meet some minimum satisfactory standard. Provide students with complex and challenging tasks that require comprehension and problem solving, rather than tasks that require little more than rote learning and verbatim recall. Use cross-age tutoring, peer tutoring, and enrichment activities rather than grade retention with students who are falling behind. Use cooperative learning methods rather than competition. Because so much has been written about the use of cooperative learning techniques and their demonstrated effectiveness in raising motivation and learning, we discuss this recommendation in more detail next. Use cooperative learning methods. As we pointed out in previous chapters, cooperative learning methods have proven effective in increasing self-esteem and motivation for learning, redirecting attributions for success and failure, fostering positive feelings towards classmates, and increasing performance on tests of comprehension, reasoning, and problem solving. Accordingly, you may want to try one or more of the cooperative learning techniques described by David Johnson and Roger Johnson. To familiarize you with these methods, we will briefly describe the student teams, achievement divisions method that Slavin and his associates at Johns Hopkins University devised. STAD is one of the simplest and most effective, flexible of the cooperative learning methods, having been used in grades 2 through 12 in such diverse subject areas as math, language arts, social studies, and science. As with other cooperative learning methods, students are assigned to 4 or 5 member groups, with each group mirroring the makeup of the class in terms of ability, background, and gender. Once these assignments are made, a 4-step cycle is initiated. Teach. The teaching phase begins with the presentation of material, usually in a lecture discussion format. Students should be told what it is they are going to learn and why it is important. Team study. During team study, group members work cooperatively with teacher-provided worksheets and answer sheets. Test. Each student individually takes a test using a scoring system that ranges from 0 to 30 points and reflects degree of individual improvement over previous quiz scores. The teacher scores the papers. 4. Recognition. Each team receives one of 3 recognition awards, depending on the average number of points the team earned. For example, teams that average 15 to 19 improvement points receive a good team certificate. Teams that average 20 to 40 improvement points receive a great team certificate. And teams that average 25 to 30 improvement points receive a super team certificate. The cooperative learning method, teams, games, tournaments, is similar to STAD, except that students compete in academic tournaments instead of taking quizzes. Another popular cooperative learning technique, Jigsaw, was created by Elliot Aronson. The class is divided into groups of about 5 or 6. Each group works on the same project, and each member of a group is solely responsible for a particular part of the project. For a project on energy consumption in the United States, for example, one student of each group may be responsible for researching and reporting to the other group members on how the price of oil is determined. Another student in each group may report on the factors that determine the size and efficiency of automobiles, still another on the status of alternative energy sources, and so on. To control for the fact that some students may not listen attentively to or may criticize the reports of others in the group because of pre-existing animosities. Maria thinks Brandon is a jerk because he insulted her friend last week. They are reminded that they will be taking an exam based on the content of each person's report. So it is in Maria's interest to lay aside her dislike of Brandon because he's the only source of part of the information she will be tested on. Before reporting to the other members of their group, the students from each group with identical assignments get together to share information, discuss ideas, and rehearse their presentations. They are referred to as the expert group. Research on Jigsaw shows improvements in listening, interpersonal relationships, and achievement when compared with traditional instruction. Maximize factors that appeal to both personal and situational interest. Find out what your students' interests are and design as many in-class and out-of-class assignments as possible around those interests. Try to associate subjects and assignments with pleasurable rather than painful experiences by using such techniques as cooperative learning and constructivist approaches to teaching, as well as providing students with the information processing tools they need to master your objectives. Link new topics to information students are already likely to have, or provide relevant background knowledge in creative yet understandable ways. Select reading materials that are logically organized and written in an engaging style. Try to make learning interesting by emphasizing activity, investigation, adventure, social interaction, and usefulness. Over 40 years ago, May Sigo suggested an approach to motivation that is based on students' interests and is consistent with many of the motivation theories and technology tools mentioned in this chapter. Among the points of appeal that emerge from studies of specific interests, she lists the following: the opportunity for overt bodily activity, for manipulation, for construction, even for observing the movement of animals and vehicles of various sorts. The opportunity for investigation, for using mental ingenuity, solving puzzles, for working problems through, for creating designs and the like. The opportunity for adventure, for vicarious experiences in make-believe, in books and in the mass media. The opportunity for social assimilation, for contacts with others suitable to the maturity level of the child, ranging from parallel play to discussion and argument, for social events and working together, for human interest and humanitarianism, and for conformity and display. And the opportunity for use of the new in real life, making new continuous with past experience and projecting it in terms of future action.